Every now and then we have a new mod that comes along and finds such a level of success it ends up being ported and converted into a standalone game. These mods are so popular that they can attract video game companies looking to capitalize on an already existing audience without an actual commercial product in place yet. Killing Floor might have originally started as a mod for Unreal Tournament 2004 back in 2005, but it has since then been released as a standalone game in 2009, with a follow-up arguably even more successful sequel in Killing Floor 2, which launched in 2016. The series has since reached an impressive reported 8 million or so copies sold, so what might have seemed like an underdog success story of sorts quickly became a global commercial success. But mirroring our recent Payday 3 episode, Tripwire Interactive, behind the Killing Floor series and many other titles, would commit many of the same mistakes of that previously mentioned title, and would not only launch a third title in 2025, Killing Floor 3, they would launch it to a resounding dud, with many fans calling it easily the worst in the series yet, and worse, a reputation-hurting level failure of a game. Currently, just like Payday 2 is with its sequel, Killing Floor 2 has more than 10 times Killing Floor 3's population, a game that, by the way, is smaller in population than the first game even. While the curtain hasn't fully closed on Killing Floor 3 yet, like with Payday 3, both of these titles found themselves in a similar wreck, where nobody even wants to touch the game, over old titles that already existed for many years, and no new updates seem to change that much. Killing Floor 3 might not be on the chopping block just yet, but it's trending in that direction, and I think I know why. I'm Ines, your mostly friendly neighborhood detective, and I like solving cases concerning why games or companies are dead or in the process of dying. That's what we do on the Death of a Game series, which is what this is. With the help of other detectives, of course, bits of evidence uncovered through traveling through a timeline that unravels as events chronicle the history of Killing Floor 3, what came before it and after its launch. And developer testimony helps us in the process too, and of course, more. We combine all of these things together to make our analysis, leading to our final deduction, where we explain it all, or crack the case, classic detective style, at the end of the episode. In case you missed any of the clues along the way. Choose your specialist. Oh yeah, did I mention that the new Killing Floor has specialists now? Oh, I didn't. Oops. But anyway, choose your specialist detectives. We have bioengineered Zeds to terminate, and a case to solve. I would like to welcome this video's sponsor, BetterHelp. If you don't know about BetterHelp, an extremely popular online therapy platform and website, let me explain. Because going to therapy like BetterHelp, my sponsor, is simple and a sign of strength and not weakness. BetterHelp is there to help you connect to a therapist in the easiest way possible, online, making therapy more approachable for you and more likely for you to stick with it. A BetterHelp therapist will listen, ask questions, and help you see new perspectives as well as give you techniques and advice to make positive changes. All you have to do is fill out a questionnaire and you will be matched up with the right therapist to make starting therapy easy and no hassle. If you don't like your therapist, you can always change them at no extra cost. Check out the link in the description, my link, to find out more information. That's betterhelp.com/nerdslayer, and you will get a 10% discount on your first month of therapy. Thank you for sponsoring this video, BetterHelp, and thank you for the support, detectives. The story begins far back in 2004 in a galaxy far away. Just kidding, I just love 2004 because it had such an impact on the gaming landscape as a whole. I sound like a Microsoft game presenter. Unreal Tournament 2004, which launched in March of 2004, and alongside it was the release of the Unreal Engine that allowed people to create their own mods within the game, and later on, from the engine itself, of course, growing to arguably the biggest gaming engine of our time. The following year in the fall, Alex Quick and his Shatterline Productions would unveil an incredibly successful cooperative survival horror that wasn't trying to be like Left 4 Dead, because Left 4 Dead didn't exist yet. Yep, that's right. Killing Floor, technically with its mod that dropped August of 2005, was the older of the zombie survival co-op horror shooters, where they are called Zeds in Killing Floor instead. This early game was like what many of you might have experienced just playing Killing Floor before, or even just playing Left 4 Dead. You must survive alongside your other friends, up to 6 players usually in Killing Floor, against hordes of incoming Zeds that increase in difficulty, especially regarding the various bosses, though Killing Floor just had its one boss, the Patriarch. Players can heal each other through the use of the medical syringe, as well as heal themselves with it, but really the game was about rewarding working together, and fighting and healing as a unit. That mod would be so successful that Alex Quick would be approached by Tripwire Interactive soon after, behind the Red Orchestra series and many other games, for requests for him to port the game to their engine, or into a standalone game. At first, Alex would decline, but after noticing Tripwire was in a bit of a financial bind after a failed project a few years later, he would elect to change his mind and work alongside Tripwire Interactive to bring his mod to a new standalone game, with Tripwire Interactive in charge of it. Killing Floor, developed by Tripwire Interactive, would launch on PC May 14th, 2009. While Killing Floor would only scrape about a 75% from most video game critics, on Steam it became an iconic classic cooperative shooter title there, where it boasted an impressive 96% score from over 20,000 ratings. Another classic example of the media just kind of getting it wrong. Killing Floor was great. It was this mixture of realism and the guns and tools that you would use throughout the game, with some more fun, kind of gamey and arcadey stuff, like slow motion time stopping, which ironically went alongside with its fear-like visuals, another shooter that also featured slow motion time stopping. And of course, the persistent perk system that the game would feature, which was kind of like leveling in an MMO or something. Fully customizable and full of variety both in weapons and gameplay options. Up to 6 players would be allowed to play together, and just like in the original mod, must work together to overcome the legions of Zeds and the Patriarch. The game felt all kinds of an ode to the mod because Alex Quick was actually the lead level designer for Killing Floor as well. And that's pretty noticeable considering Killing Floor 1 has some pretty big maps that are a bit more open-ended compared to the other newer maps. This game though would go on to sell over 3 million copies, making it one of the more successful Steam shooters, not from a major developer or publisher especially, and putting it into the Steam Hall of Fame. Killing Floor's success would lead to the creation of a sequel much later, November 18th, 2016, and like with its first title, this new one, Killing Floor 2, would make waves on Steam, being rated very positive at 88% from over 40,000 reviews. Though scoring relatively similar amongst critics, whose main issues were that the game lacked a narrative, and it didn't really have much storytelling capability, which was a fair criticism. Killing Floor 2 would add more weapons, more Zeds, and more bosses, way more of them, making the game more challenging and just more content-filled than before. It would also introduce community-modded maps and content, greatly increasing its shelf life and endearing fans to it. Killing Floor 2 would eclipse its previous title's success, selling over 4.6 million units according to sources, and helping the entire series climb up to an impressive over 100 million in revenue generated. While Left 4 Dead would, alongside its sequel as well, come and make even bigger waves, Killing Floor was still treated quite respectively, as an alternative to Left 4 Dead and one that offered a more horror-focused approach. KF might have not had L4D's success, but ultimately helped lead to the success in the first place. And since this video is about Killing Floor, a title that never really tried to be like Left 4 Dead, we won't really talk about L4D anymore, don't worry. While it's not exactly stated when the development on the sequel for Killing Floor 3 would start, based on the timeline of events, it's very likely that it was sometime between 2019 and 2020. This would make for a much shorter gap in the sequels, but that's not totally bad, as that's actually how Payday 2 was as well. But it made expectations of that game, this game, Killing Floor 3, that much higher, as you're now putting the cart before the horse, or so they say. At least, a little bit. Coming as a bit of a shock to everyone, probably even those working underneath him, John Gibson, the CEO and one of the founders of Tripwire Interactive, would post about abortion, specifically with how he was against it, unprompted, on social media. This would lead to an incredible backlash, and Tripwire Interactive was left with no choice but to part with Gibson, where they would also make a public statement that they didn't share the same stance. This departure was significant, because John Gibson wasn't just the CEO, he was actually a game designer who worked on the second game as well. This, alongside more shufflings, would lead to Killing Floor 3 fielding a reduced team when compared to some of the OG developers who worked on the previous projects. Besides Gibson's departure, we would also hear early on in the form of previews of that game that David Hensley, a major designer and artist behind the first two titles, wouldn't work on this title, and instead was now an executive at Tripwire Interactive. Joel Silverio, who helped design Killing Floor 2, would depart, as would the lead level designer and the lead writer for the series, two key positions for such a game. Some developers did remain, however, like William T. Monk II, who was a creative director on KF2 and was now the head designer for KF3. Sounds like I'm talking about KFC when I say KF3, it's like so close to it, that's making me hungry. Lee Hammock, Alan Wilson, and more were still around. And Brian Winia, who was previously an artist for like 15 years, would now be the director for the upcoming Killing Floor Project 2. I don't normally like to see that kind of move, though it can, work sometimes. That's the only questionable move that I could really see though, besides not having the same lead designer and artist behind both, games. Which we don't exactly know why that is, so it's not a knock on Tripwire, it's just a piece of the puzzle as to why Killing Floor 3 didn't pan out as much as they had hoped. Uh-oh, we're tracking a repeat perp, detectives. Right before being announced to the world, Embracer Group would grab Tripwire Interactive, who likely took advantage of the business opportunity, and also saw a chance to have future titles funded. Tripwire would be acquired through another Embracer Group video game developer acquisition, Saber Interactive. It's here you can see Killing Floor touted as having reached over 35 million players. That's not translated to sales exactly, but it's still pretty impressive. No more details were released about the acquisition, not even the dollar amount. But we, the detectives, sort of know where this is going next, as many recently covered titles in the series are Embracer Group acquisitions as well. Take with that what you will. Killing Floor 3 would be publicly announced August 22nd, 2023, taking place 70 years after the events of the second game, with the megacorp Horzine having produced this ultimate army that you must defeat. These aren't zombies anymore, really. They're actually zombies that are turned into like bioengineered monstrosities that end up being used as an army by the Horzine Corp. They're still called Zeds though, and that's probably because, well, they used to be Zeds that are now turned into like super soldiers, having many of the same original Zeds featured yet again, but with, bioengineered features. But it was still a pretty big change of things, and no details were given about when the game would launch, but there was a clue that you could catch early on in the blurb released about the game. And that was in the word, Specialist. Uh-oh, I just triggered a bunch of Battlefield fans. Specialists, as utilized in Battlefield 2042, were essentially hero classes, or roles. If this implication was directly true, it would mean that the upcoming Killing Floor game, for the first time, would actually be a hero shooter. Ironically, like Battlefield was, this would shift the series from a class shooter to a hero shooter, or a specialist shooter. Well, sort of at least. KF2 had a 10-perk system that allowed you to level up and get more progressively stronger, almost like an RPG. This change then was going to be pretty significant, and very likely not liked, as it wasn't requested and was a departure from the previous games, plural. Some fans caught this early on, before the game was even properly showcased too, so props to those detectives. Killing Floor 3 would be previewed by PC Gamer, and here Brian Winia would take center stage, describing some major aspects of Killing Floor 3, such as the slowdown of the combat and removing a lot of Zeds from the map. In my opinion, this was to combat Killing Floor 2 being a bit more arcadey in its combat, including more Zeds on the map. A bit of a fast forward though, but if the purpose was to slow things down and make them more epic, why did they remove things like the welder that was featured in both games before, a tool that allows you to seal or unseal doors to control the flow of the Zeds? But, the hype was only continuing to build. Announced to be launched the next year, March 2025, Killing Floor 3 would also have a closed beta featured in February of 2025 as well, giving people a chance to play the game for the first time. Bill Monk, an original founder of Tripwire Interactive and lead designer for the Killing Floor series, would give more details concerning the upcoming shooter, now in charge of the game's combat, where the new title was reported to have a much more active combat system now than before, making it feel more like a modern zombie survival game, allowing players to dodge, crouch, and mantle things to escape attacking Zeds, whereas before you kinda just had to tank the hits. Wanting to slow the combat down while speeding up the movement was an interesting choice, and to me more fitting in a pure action game. But Bill would also laud the game's armory system, allowing you to heavily customize your favorite guns in the game. Killing Floor 3's beta would take place starting February 19th, 2025, and although this was the moment for Tripwire to show off their new pony, instead what happened was the community nearly universally uniting to drag what they felt so far was a poor sequel. Poor pony. The big bomb players first would have to come to terms with was that the game was a specialist-based game, no longer allowing you to customize your class. If this sounds familiar, it should, when it's a big reason that many shooters fail on the Death of a Game series, forcing these specialized systems into the game. This ends up not just affecting gameplay, but also monetization, because now you have to buy skins and unlocks for 6 different characters. But that wasn't the only problem with Killing Floor 3 in beta. The art style for the series started at House of Dead for the first game, and then moved into more of like a sci-fi horror game, like kind of Quakey in the second game. The third game was straight sci-fi, and not only lacked the same horror feel of the previous games, it also lacked the atmosphere. The maps would sort of blend together in a weird blender of, genericness, and just gray color, lacking any meaningful color focus or theme throughout, leaving most of the world just this overwhelming gray. There were even more reports too, such as the game being basically unplayable for many players, including those with powerful machines. And when you did play the game, you were met with an underwhelming and less numerous arsenal of weapons often described as pea shooters or plastic launchers. These guns wouldn't draw on realism much, nor seem inspired enough to stand on their own, like from Halo or something. Tripwire Interactive was forced to make an important decision lest their upcoming title have its wings clipped before it ever took flight. As reported, Killing Floor 3, following a disastrous beta test, would be delayed just 3 weeks away from its original launch date. Tripwire Interactive would state that after taking the time to gather and discuss feedback from our recent closed beta, we realized we've missed the mark. This was an honest thing to admit, but the issues that people were having with the game weren't exactly all fixable. This was slightly different to the Payday 3 situation, where that game was unbaked, more so, and just lacking in content and polish. Killing Floor 3 was more so just straight up not really enjoyed by the player base. But Killing Floor 3 was promised to come in July, later that same year, and would they have enough time to implement game-impacting changes meant to save their game from a poor reception in just 4 months? Especially when mini-games rarely make a comeback from such a poor launch? Killing Floor 3 would launch globally, on consoles and PC, July 24th, 2025. Killing Floor 3 would score lower amongst critics with a 68 out of 100 according to accurate review website Metacritic, with more on those reviews shortly. What was most shocking for the new zombie survival shooter was that it had a 49% score on Steam, a place that it had normally dominated for the past decade plus. Killing Floor 3 was being eaten alive by its once loyal fanbase, and for good reason. Not only did many of the beta criticisms stick, such as the monochromatic color scheme and art style that lacks any classic horror feel to it, or the poor weapon arsenal both in variety and impact and sound, or even just how bad the performance was in the game even for modern machines. There were now even more criticisms about the game being introduced as people had more time to play the game, such as how slowing time, called Z time previously, wouldn't just slow down time anymore. Instead, it just slowed down the Zeds, a strange and perplexing change. This removed the feeling of the visceral, in-your-face combat that Killing Floor was kind of known for, as you would slow-mo your way through some attacking Zeds face-to-face. The physics and animations to go along with this was also worse in the sequel, with many enemies not even reacting to being hit, and seeming just totally weightless at times. For many, myself included, it felt like Killing Floor 3 had become a generic shooter and lost what made the game so special. The horror elements, and the fact that you had to customize your survivor to defeat the upcoming horde. That stuff was mostly gone. Critical reviews were far more positive by contrast, but we were not going to waste too much time on them because, well, they didn't seem to historically really understand Killing Floor as a franchise anyway. But IGN would rate the game a 7 out of 10, stating that while it felt like a more polished sequel, not sure which sequel they were playing by the way, they felt it was somewhat hollow, and felt like an early access title, which was a fair shot. Rock Paper Shotgun was far more analytical in their coverage of the game, claiming it felt like it barely iterated from the previous games, even unexpected things, like gun design and tech fidelity. But RPS would make a pretty solid point. The new armory and focus on leveling your weapons up felt like Killing Floor 3 focused more on gunplay than it did before. Gunplay that wasn't even necessarily the best to boast about, instead of teamwork, which the series was previously known for. There were some more positives about Killing Floor 3 that I should mention. The increased gore due to the meat system was kind of cool. The fact that they had full crossplay, and well, that's all I have. While some diehard fans in the comments below can probably make a case for Killing Floor 3, many of the mostly sane variety wouldn't. This was a game that only had 8 maps, which might seem impressive when the second game launched into early access with just 3, but Killing Floor 3 had quietly removed the ability to have workshop mods, now loudly making the game feel even more boring as it lacked the variety of the previous 2 games, and would just quickly get boring. I've heard many reports of the game taking no longer than just a single weekend of gaming to experience it all. But worst of all was, like one fan wrote, that the soul of the game just felt like it was completely gone in the 3rd entry, and the population on Steam would reflect this, with peak players dropping from 21,000 at launch to just 11,000. A month later, and the community was declaring that they had moved on, with peak population dropping to a dangerously low 1,700 players with just 619 players playing on average on Steam. Worse, the game reportedly only sold under 200,000 copies. The community was now claiming that Killing Floor 2 was demonstrably more popular on all platforms. But Killing Floor's community wasn't even surprised though. They were just disappointed. Like when your parents knew you were caught in a lie, as many fans would simply just question, and many more echoing those questions. What were they thinking, especially after we warned them at the first time they mentioned specialists, and especially after Battlefield 2042 already happened. October would bring even lower numbers with just over 1,000 peak players and just 365 players on average. Tripwire Interactive was quiet on the update front throughout this, but would release a roadmap for upcoming content in which they would promise 2 new maps and more in a full year. The rearmament update, as much as I want to hate it, with how the game was handled overall, was actually a good update. It added 3 world-inspired guns to the game, which was a major complaint of many of the players, including down to the sound of the space guns that you would have at your arsenal, being hated. The balance of those weapons was also affected, which was needed. When they didn't just look or sound weak, they were weak. Players could now mix and match any specialist with any perk, which didn't totally open things up, but was a step into the right direction. A direction they needlessly pushed themselves into, despite fan feedback stemming from the first time their trailers were ever showing specialists. More cool changes were brought, such as Zeds having actual bump physics to them and boss fights being tweaked to improve the game. But as of the time of this video, Killing Floor 2 has over 10 times the population of Killing Floor 3. And even if the recent update for the game does spark the population back up somewhat, that's not saying much, because even if Killing Floor 2 is currently only 10 times bigger, at some point it was much larger, reaching 30,000 and even 60,000 peak players on Steam. That means that Killing Floor 3 wasn't recouping the money that was put into it, and wasn't even eclipsing its previous title in success. And unless they plan a full relaunch for the game or some major redo-like update, there's very little chance that players will return to the game that it feels like it's still behind its predecessors in many ways, especially one that has such a negative stink about it, which is common with online gaming. The player base for Killing Floor was passionate, but they weren't dumb. They knew that the new acquisition by Embracer Group probably could have triggered some of this, which was a fair hypothesis. We have yet another title ruined by a new publisher, specifically an Embracer Group publisher, just like Payday 3 was ruined. It's hard not to imagine multiple spottings of smoke, there not being any fire. The music is playing, detectives, and the timeline has come to an end. Sure, Killing Floor 3 isn't quite dead yet, and even allows players to play it offline. It is performing far worse than its predecessor though, and about the same as the first game, which is, 16 years old. The fan base has abandoned the new sequel, and for good reason. In case you missed any of the clues along the way, what were the largest reasons that Tripwire Interactive failed with Killing Floor 3? It feels regressive as a sequel, and it just lacks innovation. A disliked art style departure. Poor performance, a lack of content and poor gameplay pacing, specialists, for some reason, lack of proper accountability and community management. That last point I'm gonna emphasize a bit more. Killing Floor always had a relatively supportive audience and community. I remember because I was a part of it, and for good reason. I mean, we had 2 good games for nearly 2 decades, and if you don't properly address your community, especially when making mistakes, they can also turn that passion that they used to have and that used to fuel your game into a potent weapon that ends up hurting that game the most. Having a dedicated core audience for every game is important, and sometimes when a multiplayer title is reaching for a broader audience, they end up alienating their already pre-existing core audience, the one that already made them over 100 million or so. Killing Floor 3, sadly, right after we just told the story of Payday 3, go watch that episode too, is yet another example of how you can take a widely successful franchise and drag it across the pavement without proper care, and knowing the proper pulse on what makes those games so fun and special in the first place. But how many more titles will Embracer Group and Co. put their hands into and ruin? And how many more titles potentially will I mistakenly blame them as being gaming's boogeyman? My guess is the first number will greatly outweigh the second, and I don't really look forward to that, detectives. You don't always want to be right. Thanks for watching, and let me know your experiences with Killing Floor as a franchise and series in the comments below, and even the third game if you did or didn't like it. And stay steadfast, detectives. Embracer Group can't possibly buy all video game developers. Can they?